Hey everyone, welcome to the Klaviyo Design Podcast. My name is Guy. I'm a product designer working on the sprint team here at Klaviyo. This week we'll be talking about copywriting in design. But first, let's go around the virtual room here and to see who's on the line to talk about this topic with us.
Cool. I'll go first. I'm Allie. It's been a while since I've been on a design podcast, so excited to be back. Copywriting is actually like sometimes the bane of my design existence, so this is a good one for me to come in and get the scoop.
I'll go next. I never know when to talk on Zoom. But anyway, I'm Sarah. I am a designer here on the Klaviyo and 60 team, working on a new onboarding experience. Like Allie, I'm not an expert in copywriting by any means, so I'm hoping to learn a little bit here as well.
I'm the key guest of the day.
I'm Karen Muller. I'm the senior copywriter here at Klaviyo, and this is my first time being on a podcast, so it's pretty cool.
What a great one to be on.
Welcome. So we usually start with the icebreaker or opening question. The one that I was thinking is like, what is your most memorable copy experience with the brand? Like something that you saw that was like, that was interesting or different or like, piqued your attention. For me, it's usually like, I don't know, whenever there's a button that, usually we're used to buttons that say, okay, continue. But when there's a button that it looks like more, there's more personality to it, like let's go, or like got it, or like, I don't know. There's more examples like that, I guess. But I really like when micro copy is like really more personal. I don't know about you folks.
Yeah, I guess I can speak to that. I'm a little bit divided on that because when it's stuff like got it or let's go and there's a good energy to it and it makes sense with the brand and it's in the right setting and it feels really natural, all of that is good. And when it is bad, it is so bad. But the one little piece of microcopy that comes to mind as an example for me, I guess rather than calling out a favorite, the thing I want to call out is when brands have the decline email option written in very passive-aggressive text. When that window pops up to sign up the form, much like the forms we do with Klaviyo. Some brands take that really far. So you can click yes, I do want email, and that's the big button usually, of course. But not the opt out, but the other option is
just
usually
saying no. Yeah.
It's something like no, I hate free money, or something that's very, I don't know. It feels like a pouting 12-year-old kind of. And I feel like that was a really big trend, maybe a couple of years ago, and I'm seeing a little bit less of it now, which is nice. But it really had a moment.
It's aimed for people like me, because then I'm like, no, I don't hate you, and I don't want to not do that.
Yeah, it's like this isn't
my
going to
email,
win me over,
sure.
but now I just feel bad.
Just wanted to click X, cancel. Yeah. Still trying to think of what my favorite or best example was.
I mean, could be the something also negative. That was like, ooh, that was not.
I feel like.
You go, Sarah.
I was just gonna say, I feel like I don't usually actually pay that close attention to copy, so maybe it's a good thing when I don't really notice it, when it doesn't like offend me. It's just like, this is copy and it's fine.
I think that can be a good thing. It's a sign that it's like functional and doing its job and not interfering with the experience or making you think too hard about it.
Yeah.
I was thinking kind of along those same lines, but instead of like not seeing it when the copy and the typeface kind of match. So if it's like this goofy type of copy and the text is a little bit that way too, like when I guess basically the design and copy work together, I've always found that kind of interesting. And it like makes sense when you think like legal script, when it's just like very like bold, like kind of ugly and small and sans serif, you know, certain things make sense with others. Almost as helpful when they do. I think it would be weird to have like a very formal text and then someone being like, "What's up?" You know, like it just would feel wrong.
Yeah.
Like all those, you know, like those impromptu warnings that people make in Comic Sans that they
Yeah.
post
It's
around.
now making me think I should do that though. Like, let's go make basically bad matching. Scared's like, absolutely not. Please do not do that.
I feel like that could be a great Tumblr. It's like all the mismatched font and
It's
tone.
quarantine life. We got the time. Let's do it.
There is a church near my apartment where all of the signs, like the professionally made large outdoor signs, are in Comic Sans. And every time I pass it in my head, I call it the Church of Comic Sans.
Oh gosh.
That was one of the better examples I've seen lately.
So let's get started on the main topic, the idea of talking about the importance of copywriting and design. And Kara, I noticed that you want to speak a little bit about myth busting, specifically on how people think of copy versus the job and what it really involves. So could you speak to
Sure,
that?
yeah. I really like talking about this stuff with designers. I guess since I worked in a design studio before this, and since I'm on the design team here now, working with a lot of designers, I like to try to talk things out when I can. But sometimes I think there are little tiny pieces of logic that make a huge difference. And I guess the main myth that I like to bust uh, is the idea that copy is really about words and comma placement and grammar and puns. I think that the language aspect of it is absolutely what got me into it. It's a fun, cool part of it, but it's kind of like the last step of the job. There's a lot of research that has to come before that can happen, and a lot of ideation and just making sure that the idea itself is solid before you can actually wrap words around it. Because if the idea isn't good, there's no possible way to turn it into a good idea with writing. And usually that becomes clear when you try to write about something and you just can't make it work. Sometimes the problem involves, sometimes in order to find the problem, you have to retrace your footsteps a little bit and do a little more digging. So yeah, I guess the ultimate myth is that copy is about words, when really it's just a business tool, and it's something that can impact the user experience and user behavior really directly, in a lot of the same ways that design can. So there are little details that might seem like they don't make a difference, or there are phrases that seem like they mean the same thing, but in context just don't work at all. And so a lot of the battle is just figuring out the nuances of those pieces and how they come together.
So in general, do you feel like designers, product people make the mistake of bringing in copy too late? Like they kind of attack it as, hey, this is all done. Can you just put a little polish on it and like tell me what this button should say, when really you should be involved much earlier?
Yeah, I think that's a thing that tends to happen a lot, and I think it does come from a really good place. I think when people are bringing ideas to me that way, and they're like, "Oh, hey, I've written half of this. Can you take this and polish it up?" They're coming into it with the intention of lightening the load and having gotten some of that work out of the way, which is a really nice thing to do. But the tricky part comes in when I can see the details that they're incorporating and the sort of surface level words that they're using, but I don't have a sense of the reasoning or the ideas that are really behind it. So if someone brings me something that's half written, I don't necessarily know the business objectives that they're most focused on, or the aspects of a product that are really most important to the customer that I need to tease out a little bit more. There are a lot of really small things like that. Sometimes I don't know who the audience is, or why we're writing the thing, aside from, hey, I need a web page. Can you make this exist?
Yeah.
Um, and there are all kinds of situations that come about. Um, but I think sort of the thing that it always requires is just a good understanding of why we're making the choices that we're making.
Yeah, more
And so
context.
getting something written can kind of bury that.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, from the design standpoint, we've always said and talked about how people think we just make a pretty picture once everything's already been formed. And it's way better if we have understood the problem and talked to people and really have been able to craft not just the pretty picture, but also this whole experience too. And it sounds like, you know, the idea of copy is the same way. It's not just a few words that like crush it. It's the whole thing that you're presenting and how it feels and seems.
Yeah. And even how design and copy come together, it's, I think when a designer and a writer are working together from the outset at the beginning, that's like the ultimate best case scenario. And there are reasons why that can't always happen, and there are a lot of situations where that doesn't need to happen. But when it does, it's great.
Yeah, I keep thinking like if you as a designer receive a brief that's like make this and without the all the things that you pointed out, like the things that you need to know and like the questions that you want to answer or like the emotions that you want people to feel, it's really tough, right? And I guess that goes to the point about why does it all matter, right? The things that you want people to understand out of it, you can tap into their emotions, and they might be distracted, so you want to make it concise, or maybe they're very concentrated right now and they want to know all the details. Yeah, it's really interesting, like this balance, right? um, I mean, it comes to mind sometimes like brands that have unique voice and tone, and some of the ones that I wrote here, I think Slack, which is a professional tool, but they also are a little bit more on the casual side. I talked about like the copy stuff and buttons. I think they do that a lot in their onboarding. um, Duolingo, which is everyone has a love-hate relationship with it, I guess. Like they can be very pushy sometimes, but it's all coming from this sort of like, yeah, like that sort of friction about being pushy, but also having your best interest in mind because they know that you want to learn. Um,
Don't lose your streak. You just lost the number 2 spot.
I can see why that's so
You're
necessary,
failing.
though. It's like you don't want a personal trainer who's too nice.
Right.
And I feel like that's just the phone version.
I think they had like a April Fool's joke or something, that they had like an extreme version of their notifications or something. I think I keep it's very fresh in my memory how memorable it was. Like this whole idea of I think it was a parrot, like their mascot, right? They would come to your
Owl.
house. Owl.
Duo.
Oh, sorry. Yes. That they
I'm
would come
learning
to your
Spanish.
house and like, yeah. And then I feel like in social media, particularly, like is where a lot of brands are exploring sort of like that sort of personality. So um, Twitter's Twitter account is surprisingly like weird in a way
Twitter's
that,
on weird Twitter.
yes, it's like they tweet these things that are very like jokes. I feel like whoever is in charge of that account really understands the culture around the product, and it's like it's quite fascinating to see that play out. Because it's not what you expect, and I think that's what makes it so memorable sometimes. Is like when brands deliberately go against what you expect. It's like Wendy's Twitter account. It's also funny. It's like they are like very sassy. Yeah, I don't know. Is there
I have,
any brands that you guys find to be particularly memorable?
I have a question before we get to that one. From your perspective, Karen, would you like more or less words to develop a tone? Like I'm wondering with like the Twitter stuff, do people like to kind of build their brand on Twitter because they're limited in what they can say? Or would you prefer to have like be able to write a huge narrative that like builds a brand? Not to
I
put you on the spot.
have a lot of feelings about Twitter.
Yes.
I was
Let's
actually,
get into them.
sadly, alas, I was thinking about it this morning.
Great.
Because I think I was a freshman in college, and it was actually a design professor who forced me to sign up for Twitter. And this was a long time ago. But at the time, it wasn't something that was used very widely. It wasn't quite in its heyday yet. And he was just like, hey, if you want to work in media, you need to be on this. I was like, this is stupid. I don't want to tell people what I'm eating for lunch. Nobody cares. But in the time since then, just like kind of hanging out and following people and following the news, it's been a really cool study in how people deal with being concise and expressing themselves and finding a sort of super distilled version of people's voices. I think there's such a kind of focus on voice on Twitter, because everything is so short and because you don't get that space to explain yourself.
Yeah.
And the ways that people use language as a result are really fascinating. I'm reading a book on this right now called Because Internet. It's basically the linguistics evolving on the internet. But that all kind of blends into copy really quickly when you start looking at all the things that these brands are doing, and especially brands that are trying to communicate with younger people that kind of need to be aware of how these changes are taking place and what things actually mean. And even when I'm writing copy for Klaviyo, I know we're not exactly a Gen Z focused brand, but I still look things up on Urban Dictionary left and right just to make sure I'm not saying something that could be construed in a way that is very different from how I mean it. So I think there's always kind of that awareness in the back of your head of like, okay, so the dictionary definition is this, but like
What
in
else?
this context, what else could it mean?
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, I think the constraints of Twitter and like the way that it forces you to be concise really makes people go to the point. Like I noticed that the platform really changed a bit when they doubled the capacity in recent years. It's like now that people have more space, and with threads too, right? You can you can basically write a full blog post on Twitter if you want. But yeah, I really appreciate the conciseness of it, and how it like forces you to get to the point. Yeah.
Another space that's been really interesting for just kind of focusing on those specific things has been email subject lines. Um, kind of relevant to us, I suppose. In a different job before this, I used to write a lot of subject lines all day. And so I would always look at what other brands were doing. And one example that comes to mind of a brand that does something really interesting with their voice. Do you guys know the clothing brand Reformation? It's kind of like an upscale women's brand. I think it was like an LA boutique, but they've reached all over the country at this point. But their clothing isn't anything too out there looking, but their brand voice and especially their emails. I sound like a real nerd for the level I'm about to geek out about this. But even like their email subject lines, they're really brief and they're in all have kind of that tone of it's not really even like a good friend. It's like that best friend who you're so close with that you constantly send each other like kind of bratty texts and your love is on like that sibling level. It's very jarring at first when a brand interacts with you that way, but it really gets your attention. And that's what Reformation subject lines are constantly. I don't know if they're continuing to do that. It was a few years ago when that really caught my eye, but that example's really stuck with me.
Yeah.
How do you feel about emojis in subject lines?
I'm a little fascinated by them. I think there's something that this is going to be a weird soapbox to get on, but I think there's something that gets underestimated a lot. I think in general, people think emojis and they're like, okay, you're a millennial. Like, this is serious. We can't use emojis. Or they think that there are I think that they have a lot of potential and value, especially in spaces like subject lines, depending on the brand. But even for a SaaS brand like Klaviyo, they can have a big impact. And if you use them in a smart way, they can catch people's eye. And I think they really function the same way as language in that kind of context. Like it has a really specific meaning in that setting, and you read a sentence with an emoji in the middle of it in a specific way. So I think it can give you like a little more freedom, and it can be a good way to play with the mood of something. So I'm a bit of a fan, but I say that very carefully.
Yeah,
Like the
I'm a
UX
big
team.
fan.
Yeah, I was gonna say the UX team, especially the big emoji people over here.
Oh,
Yeah.
Slack, I'm just left and right. It's out of control in Slack.
He puts
Yeah.
emojis in every document he
I
creates. Just
But
all of
effective ones.
they
Very
are.
good.
He's very good at choosing the right.
Quality.
oh my.
It's part of his voice and tone.
I
The Gee style.
Personal brand.
Yeah.
You know, there's these key moments that I remember vividly about like when a feature gets released that is so exciting or so game changing that I remembered the moment that I heard about it. And Slack reactions is one of them. I remember when they announced it and I was like, "Oh my God, this changes everything." Because now, you know, you can express yourself through all these ways, and it's, you know, you feel like that feeling of like all the things that I can do with this, which I think is the best thing you want to ensure. You know, like you want to put in your users is like, oh, I can take this to many places, and yeah, Slack reactions and emojis, custom emojis too is a big one. Um, we have a few for our own team here.
A few.
I feel like thinking about all those things, just Slack and reactions and other ways to sort of add that little bit of emotional context around a phrase, in really the same way that you do in like a copy design relationship. I feel like all of those things are coming into play a little bit more now working from home, just because we're not always on a Zoom call with each other. And so much is happening in Slack. And sometimes you can't just look across the desk and see like, okay, this person knows that like I mean this feedback in the best way possible and not aggressively. And with Slack, yeah, no, I think it helps to have those little visual cues or just other ways of showing the tone, because not everybody has time to think about the way they're getting things across when you're busy.
Yeah, there's a whole science in interpreting emojis and punctuation. It's like if you do two ha-has, is that being ironic?
Oh man,
You know, like all these things.
that is the book that I'm reading right now. I'm not even kidding with you.
I
That's
just watched
great.
the Office episode where they talk about the dot, you know, and they're like, 2, mistake, 3, like normal, 4 or 5, like we put another level and it's just period.
It's kind of fascinating though when you think about all of that had to come from somewhere, and 50 years ago it didn't mean the same thing, and how did we get from there to here? And just even if you look at, I don't know, looking at old ad copy is so interesting. Usually it doesn't hold up too well, but it's so interesting.
So, getting into a little bit of the process of writing copy. So, we always ask people like, what does a day look like, you know, as a copywriter?
That's a good question. I guess so. This is the cop out answer, but it is 100% true. I don't think there is really a very routine day in this job, which is why I like it. Um, I like that you always have to kind of think on your feet a little bit. Um, but I guess in general, the things that I think about going through a day are, let's say a new creative brief comes in and it has all the details to kick off a new project. Part of the morning might be spent, you know, going through that and making sure all of the information that I need to write whatever the thing is actually in that brief, or do I need to follow up with some questions? And I think that questions are a really, really huge part of this job. Um, just being a pain and continuously asking people but why do you want this? Or, but what is that for? I think that's huge. So just kind of like looking through all that information, synthesizing it, and then kind of getting to the stage of brainstorming or trying to come up with whatever the idea is that you're working with. If it's a big project, you might, have a huge brainstorming session and really be looking for that one really big idea that you can go off on an exploration with, and then, get a lot of feedback from people. With other projects, it's just a really quick turnaround. Sit at your desk, write up 15 headlines for a banner ad and get some people's thoughts on them, and then, keep beating them up, and eventually you wind up figuring out what's going to work. But it's a lot of just constantly reading things and asking questions.
So I'm really curious about like the validation process. So like, how do you know that this piece of copy works best? Like, do you just go to people that have never heard of the concept and then like see if they can get it, or like, I don't know, how does it work?
That's a really good question. I think there are kind of two parts to it. Like when I'm working on a project and I'm trying to get to that initial place where I'll have an idea that's even worth putting in front of people, it's a lot of just constantly asking myself the question, yeah, but who cares? And if I can keep asking myself that question and I haven't really gotten to whatever the idea at the core of the project is, or if I haven't figured out what I can say in the headline that will make someone care about the rest of the web page, then it's really not ready to keep moving yet, and I have to keep working at it. But once I can do that, and I feel like I can kind of stand behind the rationale there, it's, I would say, a combination of just running things past teammates and designers for feedback about what's doable and what sounds good to them, because good copy never happens in a vacuum. It's also a bit of just looking at best practices and seeing what other websites, either in the industry that generally, do good work, kind of like what their starting point is, what they're working with. If we're either doing something in that neighborhood or have reason to do something better. It's a lot of learning from examples, I would say.
And what about on the flip side? So with design, we try to be better about measuring success, looking at like metrics of how whether the design is working, which can sometimes be hard. How does that work for copywriting?
It's pretty similar, I guess. Yeah, when something actually goes out in the world, and especially if it's something new that we've never worked on before, like a new kind of ad, just doing any kind of testing that we can on it to see how it is being received, or if it is influencing conversions or signups or engagement in some way. And sometimes that can be measured more directly than other times. But all of that stuff kind of creates a good benchmark, and then you can keep working on it and finding ways to make it better, make progress from there.
Always room for improvement.
Yeah.
So how does someone, you mentioned a little bit about like looking at other companies that, other examples, or in general, like how would someone get, if they want to get really good at copy writing, like how would one do that?
I ask myself every day. I think probably what I've found to be most helpful with copywriting, and also just with writing in general, is getting an absolutely brutal editor who doesn't let you get away with anything, but someone that explains their edits really well and doesn't just say, no, don't do that, but they have to give you the reasons behind it. And sometimes it's more doable on the job than other times, due to time constraints. But I think if that's something that someone wants to develop, finding someone in their life or a mentor of some kind that can really give a lot of feedback on their work is huge. Something else that sticks with me is back when I was kind of getting started with all of this, and taking a course back in the day, it actually was an ad copy professor, and he was talking about the design copy relationship and coming up with that big idea that everything comes together around. This is mostly in the context of really traditional like magazine print advertisements. Uh, but I think it's relevant to a lot of things. But he was basically saying if it's your only idea, it's not a good idea. And I think in a lot of contexts, you can stumble on something and it works, or it seems like it works, and you don't have to keep looking. You have a good feeling about it, and like, yeah, cool. It's probably like a halfway okay idea, but you have to keep pushing yourself beyond that, or you're not going to find anything that's better than just okay. And so I think it's kind of freeing to have that brainstorming process where you're like, okay, right now I'm just going to come up with as many ideas as I can think of, and they don't all have to be good, and some of them are probably going to be kind of dumb and kind of goofy, and I'm just going to throw them all out there and we can wade through them and figure out which ones work later. But like, not putting the pressure on yourself to have great ideas, just to have a ton of them, and then you can evaluate them later. So those are a couple things.
That's really similar to how design also operates. I feel like in terms of, getting tons of volume out there, expressing multiple different avenues, because probably the first one you have is not the best one.
Yeah.
Right? That's
The
really nice.
class that I was like learning a lot of this in back in the day, it was really based on, and I think it's still like the best way of thinking about this. It was focused on the design copy relationship and sort of like working together to build that hierarchy in an ad or on a web page or whatever. But basically, the communication falls apart if that hierarchy doesn't exist. So just spending a ton of time thinking about how that works has been helpful.
And Sarah, I know you worked on, you helped with some of the Klaviyo UX copywriting guidelines that we use. Could you speak a little bit more about that process?
Yeah, so the pieces that I touched were regarding how we talk about errors in the product. So basically, I was working on guidelines because our errors were just kind of all over the place, both in terms of the components we used and the language that we used. So there's a lot of best practices out there for UX copy in terms of errors. And I feel like the main pieces of that are to just like not blame the user for anything. You don't want them to feel bad for making a mistake because it's probably not actually their fault. Avoiding technical language. So you don't want to be like 500 network error, like
Yeah.
random words that nobody understands, because that's also just like confusing and scary to get. It's like, oh my God, what just happened? Um, and just in general, like being very specific about what's wrong and also how to fix it. Like, you don't want to tell someone like something went wrong, but they have no idea like what went wrong or why or what they can do to fix the problem. So yeah, I feel like my process was just like doing a bunch of research on what other products do and what the well-known best practices are, and then trying to apply it to Klaviyo. And yeah.
Yeah, I guess you can really tell as a user when you're using something, like when you stumble upon an error that hasn't been like really thought out. Because it's usually like just the computing part of it, just like boom, like dumping something on you. And like even if they give you an error code sometimes, I feel like, what am I supposed to do with this? It's like, I don't know, Google it.
But you feel really good like if you figure it out. You're like, oh gosh, I forgot an S, and the error was like random code script, and you're like, that could have been easier to understand. But then you're like, but I figured it out. I'm so impressive.
Yeah, but Klaviyo definitely has some like weird things going on. Like there's, in terms of voice, even in one place in the app, we use the word bonkers when there's an error, which is like so not Klaviyo at all and just doesn't fit in. So that's definitely to be avoided.
We definitely still have some kinks to work out on that end. That's in the works.
Glad we pay Karen the big bucks.
And one thing that comes to mind when dealing with copy and UX is the idea of internationalization and how you have to support languages. And a lot of times, I think German gets a bad rap on this front, but you get a word, and that word is so much longer in other languages. I found this spreadsheet. It's really interesting. Like you put a piece of, I have the link in the show notes, but basically you put the copy that you want in the top, and then it will automatically translate for you, how that look like in all these other languages, and it gives you the number of characters. So like whenever you're writing something, you can keep like in the top of your mind, like, okay, maybe sometimes they even come up with different words altogether for certain languages that might be kind of complicated on that front. So just something that I know that we are going to have internalization sometime in the future. But yeah, it's just an interesting, piece of this whole puzzle of coming up with copy and products and stuff.
Yeah, I feel like Klaviyo is guilty of having really long buttons. Like we'll
Yeah.
shove like 5 words into the button for no reason, and I can only imagine what that looks like in a language where the words are much longer, or when one word is actually multiple words, and just like a button takes up half the screen. So I guess that's something that we should try to get better at in our UX copy. Shorter buttons.
That's one big thing that I think a lot of UX copywriters are responsible for on digital products in general, is even if you're just writing something in English and it's going to be primarily read by an audience that speaks English, there are certain websites that use either different ways of translating, or you can expect the website to be read by someone where they speak English, but maybe it's not their first language. So when it comes to that kind of user experience, and especially when you are trying to help someone find what they're trying to accomplish, trying to guide them through an experience, it really comes down to, are you saying this in a way that can't easily be misconstrued? Or are you using a weird idiom that is going to confuse the heck out of this person when it gets translated, or something like that? That's another really interesting piece of the puzzle.
I was just looking it up. One thing that I found fascinating about what you just mentioned is, do you guys know the Simple English Wikipedia?
I have not heard of that.
So yeah, Wikipedia has, you can browse Wikipedia in multiple languages, and one of those is Simple English. And it's, all the articles in there are supposed to be, English that is, very accessible, even though it's
That's
supposed to be
awesome.
like, yeah, it's really cool, like really accessible. And like, even though it's supposed to be an encyclopedia with a bunch of terms that are complicated, the whole point of that initiative is to like make it more accessible and use like, only certain terms. It's quite a, there's like that Reddit explaining me like a 5-year-old. So it's like, it reminds me a little bit of that.
Oh,
Which
that
I
Reddit is great for trying to figure out how to write copy about a technical product. That is the job sometimes. Not like a 5-year-old per se, but figuring out how to break things down and keep breaking them down.
Any final thoughts on copy before we move to recommendations?
Maybe like one last word from Karen on like what is the most important thing if people take away from this episode when it comes to copy, like what is the most important thing?
That's a good question. I think the most important thing, um, that I've found has been figuring out how to have a really productive feedback conversation, which really requires, it's not something that can be done very hastily, and it's not always something that can just be done through, um, writing some edits in a Google Doc or something to that effect. A lot of the time that can work, or that's a big part of the conversation. But a lot of the time with copywriting, I think it can seem like the issue is with the words themselves or the way that something is written, and not with kind of like the underlying framework that is setting up the thing, um, setting up the written work. So I guess as a copywriter, if I have a fuzzy understanding of something, but I think I have a really clear understanding of it, and I run ahead and I write about it, um, the outcome's probably not going to be great. So I think just being able to have a lot of really clear feedback, uh, and talk things through with people is so important.
Well said.
Cool.
uh, all
You guys are all
right.
good on that front.
Yeah, I keep thinking about the parallels, right? Like when you are trying to solve problems as a designer, like if you can solve this problem, but you might not actually get to the core of what caused this whole thing in the first place, right? So keep asking questions. Like, there's multiple examples in like things that, they might make this a little bit better, but people still are not, the jobs to be done or whatever hasn't been really addressed. So it's really fascinating how these two realms kind of intersect. Uh,
Yeah, they're so similar.
cool. So moving on to recommendations. So this is the part of the show where we talk about things that we like or want to plug. I guess Allie, you just added something here to the doc.
Oh yeah. In my last second recommendation ad, I'm going to recommend this game, and I think it's actually an older game called Hanabi. And it's a card game, but instead of you seeing your cards, you hold them so that the rest of the group can see them, and you work as a team to try and stack them in the right order by like giving hints, um, and like just working together and like remembering which cards are which. Uh, it's a good one to like play with a group and all work together. It's
That's
fun,
cool.
and it's very mobile. It's just a small little deck, so not that people are moving much right now, but it's besides the point.
Is this one of those games that you can play in a Zoom call or no? Do you need? Oh, is it the deck?
Yeah, you need like a
Okay.
specific deck, and then also like if I was holding them up, you'd be able to see them, but I'd also be able to see myself.
Okay, never mind.
But I like the thought.
Cool. So I have quite a few. I've been playing The Last of Us Part Two. Is a video game. I think it does. Speaking of copy and like character development, I think it does a lot of things really well on that front. Not that it has like any rich text or anything, but I think it has nuance in the story that I feel like a lot of times video games, especially around action, don't. So it's like you don't have that clear picture of a villain and the hero. It's like they everything is like a little bit of a shade of gray. So I think it really pushes the boundaries of how you can tell a story in that format. And in copy, I use Grammarly to help me with my typos because ever since the iPhone came out and I rely a lot more on autocorrect, I feel like that that habit has unfortunately come back to the computer, like the desktop, or so I really rely on these tools to help me not make as much typos. And the last one is this tool that I just found like a few days ago. It's called Rome Research. Um, it's a note-taking app, but what really sets it apart is this concept of bi-directional links. So it tries to map the way that the mind works, which is around connections. So a lot of note-taking apps, they force a hierarchy on you. So like, this note exists on this page, it's part of this other page. But in this app is more like you have insights and you can connect those insights however you like and then see how like in a map like these nodes and ideas connect to each other. I don't know. I'm just starting with it. But I found it really fascinating when like, you think that there's, the problem of note taking has been completely explored and then suddenly someone comes along with a completely new idea. So yeah.
That's
So
really
that's
cool.
like a very visual note taking approach, I guess.
it is visual in the sense that you can see the map, like how things connect, but it's surprisingly very like, based on just text. Actually, I think their product does a good job at all explaining what it is for, how is it different, or like, yeah, I actually had to go like, find the community is very active, so people are like excited to explain in several blogs and stuff. But yeah, the product itself really needs some help.
Sounds like you
Speaking
need a
of
good
copy,
copywriter.
like they really need some better like, clarity around that. But yeah.
Guy's calling him out.
I mean, the creator has already like said, like, yeah, we need better onboarding. Like they were like really pushed on that. I think they're very
Oh,
early on in their development. But yeah.
very self-aware. I guess I have a couple copy related recommendations. Copy adjacent, I guess. So the book that I mentioned earlier, Because Internet, if you are a real copy nerd, or if you just are either really into language or maybe a little bit too online, um, it's really, really an interesting read. I think that reading about linguistics sounds impossibly dry until you realize that it's really those things like, but if I spell hey with four Y's at the end, why does it mean something different? Like this is a book that's asking those questions. And so it's kind of like linguistics, the next generation. Um, and that's an incredibly dorky thing to say, but it's really, really interesting. And my other recommendation is any number of the goofy, um, very geared towards Instagram, like influencer font apps that you can use to post in different fonts rather than sort of like the standard setting that you would have on Instagram or Twitter. I feel like that's kind of the next generation of people bringing weird tone aspects into their kind of online presence. And it does create a different context. Um, but it's also mostly just fun to mess with. Uh, so I recommend it again if you're a little too online.
What's the name of the app? Do you know?
I think the one that I have, so I'm on an Android phone, so this might not be the best one, but it's called Fonts for Instagram, and I think it was free. A lot of the fonts are really bad, but some of them are so bad it's hilarious, which makes them fun if you're texting your friends. And that's that's what I want you to take away from all
And
that.
that's what's valuable here. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Perfect.
that's the
I'm,
takeaway.
I'm really curious to see how it looks like. I don't think I've seen like people do crazy fonts on my feed just yet. Maybe I'll
Start a
follow
That
along.
might be a good thing. That might mean you're making good choices.
All right, my recommendation, also a last minute one, is actually a cleaning product because there's not too much to get excited about in COVID times, but cleaning is one of them, I guess. But I've been using these products from a brand called Blue Land, and they do these like zero waste cleaning products. So they sell like little tablets that you just dissolve in water, and then it's like your cleaning product. So it's pretty cool. So if you are doing some extra cleaning to not, get the coronavirus, would recommend.
That is a
keeping
solid
everyone
tip.
healthy and clean here. Thank you, Sarah.
Yep,
Keeping us practical here.
that's me.
All right, everyone. That's it for our show this month. We'll see you next time.
Woo.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.